Michael, you sit here. Easy. Hello, Hale Esfandiari. I think most of you know me, so I skipped the usual explanation of who I am and I'm not. But we are delighted to have with us today two top experts in the field of Iran's nuclear program. The reason why I invited them was that both of them were in Vienna in the last during the last negotiation, and they each have a different take on how the negotiations went. When I read Michael's piece and Reza's piece, I thought it would be wonderful to have them come here and share their viewpoint with us. You all know Michael. He is a public policy scholar at the center, and he writes extensively about the diplomacy in the Iranian nuclear crisis. He has covered almost all the talks between the P5+1 and Iran, and has interviewed key players in the diplomacy. He was instrumental to bring to the center Ban Ki-moon and led Amano.
Right.
Amano is more important than Ban Ki-moon. At least Amano doesn't change his mind. Invite, disinvite, you know. So, and conducted a conversation with him. Again, while he was in Vienna, he interviewed him. So he has access to a lot of top experts in the field. To my right is Reza Marashi, who is speaking for the first time, I think, at the Wilson Center. I've always seen him on the other side of the room and kept an eye on him and was looking for an opportunity to bring him here. He joined NIAC in 2010 as the organization's first research director, and he came to NIAC after 4 years in the Office of Iranian Affairs at U.S. Department of State. And prior to his tenure at State, he was an analyst at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, covering China, Middle East issues, and a Tehran-based private strategic consultant on Iranian political and economic risk. He has written extensively for magazines and newspapers, and we are delighted to have him with us. Each of the speakers will speak for 10 minutes, and then I will ask them the first couple of questions, and we will then open the floor to questions and actually short questions and no long comments. Michael, you have the floor,
Thank
please.
you very much. Well, thank you all for coming, and I know you all are aware of the details of this story. My feeling is that the talks in Vienna are the real talks. There was so much controversy in this town about the joint plan of action, so much criticism of it. But that joint plan of action was basically just finding a way to go forward. It was the framework for the talks which are now taking place. So in no way did the joint plan of action give the Iranians much of anything. It merely cleared the way for talks to begin while assuring that the Iranians wouldn't make significant progress on their nuclear program while they took place. So in a sense, we're at point zero, where for the first time, both sides, Iran and the 6 major powers, led by the United States, of course, are going to have to grapple with what is the final shape, or what will be the final shape, of Iran's nuclear program. And it's almost as if everything you've heard before doesn't count. This is where either real concessions are made and the deal is worked out, or things fall apart. And what you saw in Vienna was that when the two sides sat down, they stressed that it was mainly to set an agenda and to get a framework for going forward. But they also discussed the issues, and there was zero agreement. And at the end of the talks, there was no written document. And that was a sign that they really were unable to agree on much, and that already from the first meeting, as was to be expected, there were serious divides between the two sides. And the divides are over the question of how many centrifuges Iran will have, that is, its ability to enrich uranium into what can be fuel for a reactor, but also the explosive core of an atom bomb. What's going to happen to Iraq, the heavy water site where they would be able to make plutonium, which is the second major route to making a nuclear weapon, and what will happen with Fordo, which is the secret site that was discovered, which is a second enrichment plant, and where they have been enriching to 20%. And the Iranians do not want to have said they don't want to dismantle any centrifuges, they don't want to dismantle Iraq, and they don't want to dismantle Fordo. So right away, we've got areas of stark disagreement. There also are questions of how much Iran would reduce its stockpile. It's already reducing its stockpile of 20% enriched uranium, but there was a huge stockpile, some 8,000 kilograms of LEU, which can make perhaps 5 to 6 nuclear weapons. And then there are two issues which have been outside the talks so far, but which must be part of the talks, but which Iran doesn't want to be part of the talks, and that is the question of possible military dimension of Iran's nuclear work and the question of Iran's missile program, because the missile would be the delivery vehicle for a nuclear weapon. And then there's one gray area, which is really very interesting, which is research and development. And the question would be how much research and development Iran could do. And this is really a spoiler. And this is almost something which I think snuck in unnoticed, or people weren't paying that much attention to it. Iran is developing more sophisticated centrifuges, which can reach more quickly. It's already got 2, 3, 4 generations in the pipeline. If Iran were to dismantle all of its IR-1 centrifuges, the rudimentary centrifuge which it has installed right now, and we're able to develop a centrifuge which can enrich 10, 15 times more effectively, then these centrifuges would be able to break out much more quickly than the IR-1s with much smaller numbers. So what happens with these is very, very crucial. And one way in which this is already impacting the whole tenor of the discussions, I was speaking to some Iranians, and they said that the United States has agreed to something which the Americans say they haven't agreed to, which is that Fordo would no longer be having production cascades for enriching to 20% or to 5%, but that it would become the research center. And there would be one cascade. A cascade can be 164 centrifuges or 174 or more per research centrifuge. So they would have a centrifuge which would enrich 3 times more effectively. It would have one cascade. They'd get another centrifuge which could enrich 5, 6 times more effectively. It would get its own cascade. I really think the U.S. Congress would have a lot of trouble with this, but this apparently is already, according to Iranians I've spoken to, part of the agreement. But this is just to show you the type of discussion that there will be going forward. We're at the stage where the thing we've heard already, we're going to hear again and again, which is that the proof is in the pudding and the devil is in the details. And these technical details are almost philosophical points that define what sort of agreement we get. And right now, there is not much agreement on these. But interestingly, for each of these chapters I outlined, centrifuges, Iraq, Fordo, there could be technical fixes. And what I think is a likely way, if there is an agreement, would be that you have these 5 or 6 main points where there are problems. And on each of these points, there'll be some kind of solution, some kind of agreement. So perhaps the United States might like there to be only 4,000 IR-1 centrifuges. In a final agreement, there might be 6 or 7. And then on Iraq, there'll be something more according to the U.S. line. And it'll be a package which, when you look at it, is acceptable to nobody. But the whole package will represent what the U.S. administration will feel is an answer to their main criterion, which is that Iran is not able to make a nuclear weapon. And the Iranians will feel that it leaves them with the capabilities they need to pursue a civilian program and also to feel that they haven't given everything up. And if this sort of package is reached, the administration would go both to Israel and to Congress, the two main naysayers to an eventual agreement, and say, look, you may not be happy with details here, but look at the whole package. It works. This will prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and this will guarantee that the Iranian program is peaceful. That's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that as we go along, the Iranians would become more confident that the sanctions regime is less hurtful to them and will be less hurtful in the future, and they will be making higher and higher demands about what they can keep. And that the United States, on its side, might, in desperation to get a deal, might be making concessions which never could fly with the Congress and with Israel. In that case, things could fall apart. Those are the two way I see things going forward. But I guess my message at this point, and the message I was trying to bring in Vienna, is that we're back at the stage where there seems to be an irreconcilable gap between the two sides. Now, of course, it's much different now. We've had these incredible diplomatic breakthroughs since Rouhani assumed the presidency, where the two presidents have spoken to each other, where it is no longer a question of whether there'll be bilateral talks between the United States and Iran. The two sides really are talking, and the joint plan of action was really an achievement. So as dark or as irreconcilable as things might look at this stage, you've got to look at what happened with the joint plan of action and think, if it's the same process, we could have an agreement at the end. So that's how I see things going forward. And certainly I hope things work out, but I don't think we should be over-optimistic. I think it's a rough road to hoe, that there are significant differences between the two sides. There's an incredible amount of politics, both domestic and international, yet to play out in the talks, and we'll have to see how they work out.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for being Reza. Don't speak so fast as you speak in your conversation, so people can follow you.
No problem.
Okay, 10 minutes.
Sure, no problem. Thank you. Thank you for having me today. Khalei's had one of the best Middle East shops in town for a very, very long time, and I think all of you being here is a testament to that. So the Wilson Center is lucky to have her. And Michael ended on a reasonably optimistic note, and I think that's good because I think it accurately reflects where we are, but he also acknowledges the very real challenges that we have going forward. I mean, this is not going to be easy. Nobody should be under any illusions, and frankly, I don't think anybody is under any illusions about how difficult this is going to be. That being said, it's equally important to acknowledge that we are in uncharted waters. 9 months ago, where we are today would have been inconceivable to over 90% of the people sitting in this room. Inconceivable. Hassan in Tehran is talking to Hussein in the White House. Inconceivable 9 months ago. John Kerry and Javad Zarif, respective foreign ministers of our two countries, regular direct communication with one another, emailing one another. John Kerry talks about it at the podium as a passing reference. Inconceivable 9 months ago. So understanding that, where is this road leading? Where are we now, and what can we expect going forward? I think there's a few points that are worth noting. The first point is that, as my father likes to say, it either will or it won't. That's what it comes down to at the end of the day when we're talking about negotiations between Iran and the P5+1. There's no gray area here. The status quo is not sustainable. And we know that the status quo is not sustainable because both sides made a conscious decision to step back from the brink of war, buy themselves time by signing on to the joint plan of action, and de-escalate tensions and create a window for diplomacy to move forward. That's how we know that the status quo isn't sustainable. We have to pay less attention to the words that both sides say and pay more attention to the concrete steps that they have taken since Rouhani came into office and the political risks that they've taken to take those steps. Not just what they have done so far, but also the political risks that will be necessary to achieve a final deal going forward. So whether or not you support diplomacy or oppose diplomacy, you can't deny that we're in a very different place now than frankly we have been over the past 35 years, and that's crucial for what lies ahead. So what does lie ahead? I think as the next 4 or 5 rounds, and there will be another at least 4 to 5 rounds in Vienna between now and July, we should understand 3 key points. One is that we're finally playing the long game. What does that mean? Prior to the negotiations that have taken place under Obama and Rouhani, negotiations were stop and start. There was a lot of sermonizing on the Iranian side prior to Dr. Zarif taking over the negotiations. Very tellingly, a senior American official told us in Vienna that the days of sermonizing are over. And I think that was an indirect reference to Mr. Jalili, who was running the negotiations beforehand. So we have another 5 to 6 months to make these negotiations succeed. Nobody should expect any miracles, but instead we should place a premium on a longer-term view. And we should place a premium on patience, understanding that it's going to take some time to talk through the very real and difficult issues that Michael have outlined. I don't think 35 years of enmity can be undone over the course of a few meetings. And a generation of officials in Tehran and in Washington have made careers out of proving how nasty they can be to the other side. Undoing that, or at least hitting the pause button, hitting the brakes, is not an easy thing to do. Both sides should be given credit for taking the steps to do so, but we should also understand that it's very easy to slip back into old patterns if attempts to break the deadlock do not yield immediate results. But diplomacy very rarely yields immediate results. So it's essential that both sides have tangible deliverables at some point in time in the not-so-distant future to beat back the respective spoilers that very frankly do exist, not only in Tehran, but also in Washington. So we have to ask ourselves, what's our goal? If it's to secure a final nuclear deal that can win the peace and start the process of deeply changing a very adversarial US-Iran relationship, I think we're in a good position right now. And the reason why we're in a good position is because we've never been in this position. So we should call it what it is. Top officials from both sides are now highlighting the long-term benefits of engagement, and they're making the political investments that are necessary. So playing the long game, that's one. 2, they're emphasizing process. Michael touched upon this as well. I didn't realize we would have this many overlaps. Over the next 4 to 5 rounds of talks, both sides are going to seek a kind of compromise that leaves everyone with something, but not with everything. Establishing a real process that allows both sides to methodically shave down decades of mistrust is going to take a roadmap that provides some kind of strategic endgame. And it's important to understand that that's where we're going now for the first time in over 3 decades. And you don't need to make the details of this public right away. In fact, it's better that they don't, because the more they're talking to people like me and Michael in Vienna, the less they're talking to one another. And that's when things can start to go bad, yeah? So it's better that they spend more time talking to each other than us. But understanding now what they've done is they've essentially created a matrix to divide the various issues, and there's a lot of them that they don't agree on, into now, soon, and later. That's how you get it done. You try to slay the wolf nearest the sled and resolve the issues that are the low-hanging fruit, and there aren't very many of those, by the way. And once you get to those, you build the momentum to get to the more difficult issues. And that's going to take a while. And then you take the momentum if and when you're able to resolve those, and that's when you get to the really difficult issues: banking sanctions, oil sanctions, possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. All of these kinds of issues that are really difficult to crack, that's when you can start to discuss those. So this idea of reciprocity depends on how they set up the working groups, how they're carried out. They're going to have 4 to 5 meetings in Vienna, and technical experts are going to meet in between. So nobody can accuse the two sides of not setting up a real process the same way that it works everywhere else in the world as it pertains to diplomacy. The third point that I would make is this idea of red lines. The Iranians have laid down red lines. The Obama administration has laid down red lines. Lord knows the Israelis have laid down red lines. The Saudis have everybody's got a red line, right? But red lines are set at the beginning of any negotiation. That's to be expected. The dirty little secret that nobody really likes to admit publicly is that red lines become flexible lines once negotiations start. They have to, or there's nothing to negotiate over. Yeah? Iran does not believe that it's negotiating from a position of weakness. Irrespective of what those of us here today think, they don't think they are. Neither does the P5+1. The P5+1 does not believe that it is negotiating from a position of weakness. Both are expecting a lot from one another, and they're also expecting the other side to give up more than they have to give up. Again, that's pretty natural at the outset of any real and serious negotiation. The difficult part, I think, is going to be the realization on both sides that neither is as strong as they think, and neither is as weak as the other side thinks. We can see this idea start to crystallize because the mentality of the negotiators has changed. Rather than exchanging ultimatums, they're exchanging new ideas. And not only are they exchanging new ideas, when one idea doesn't work, they're trying something else. And that's how diplomacy works. And more importantly, that's why it takes time. So it's fair to say that this is a very difficult process. It is. And it's fair to be skeptical. We should be. But it's unfair to stop the sentence there. To finish the sentence, we must say that everything that has happened up to this point has been unprecedented. And we should use that momentum going forward to tackle the very real and tough challenges that lie ahead. And we should believe that this process can succeed. Not that it will succeed, but that it can succeed. Otherwise, what's the point? So I'll stop there. I'll turn it back to Khale and we can get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. We had the Israeli Minister of State for Intelligence speaking in a public meeting here yesterday. His position was that sanctions have helped to bring the Iranian to the table. So therefore, if we continue with more rigorous sanctions, the Iranians are probably, and I'm paraphrasing him and summarizing what he said, accepting the demand of dismantling their nuclear program and zero enrichment. Michael, what is your take on that? Are the Iranian capable of doing it? Is it fair to ask the Iranian to do?
Well, I think in terms of sanctions, the goal of sanctions was to bring Iran to the negotiating table. So the sanctions have accomplished what they were meant to accomplish. The two things Iran wanted going into any talks was to get some sanctions relief and to know what the end game is. Now, the Joint Plan of Action, the Joint Plan of Action clearly laid out in its very first paragraph that Iran would get to keep some enrichment and also outline some sanctions relief. So I think the position of the administration is that the sanctions have done their work. They brought the two sides to the negotiating table. And now it's the time to see what negotiations can yield. So I think sanctions could really be counterproductive at this stage. And the goal was never to bring Iran to its knees for an unconditional surrender. The deal was to get into talks. So we've got to see what talks yield. I think that we have already reaped the low-hanging fruit. I think the Joint Plan of Action was the low-hanging fruit. And I think what we're running into now, especially with possible military dimensions and with the question of missiles, is the really intractable issues. But we've gotten to this stage, as Reza pointed out. It's an unprecedented place to be, and we've got to see how it works out. And I really think sanctions would be a spoiler at this point, and I think everybody's accepted that.
Reza, but before you answer me, can I please ask you to close your cell phones? I forgot to tell you that it interferes with our live webcast. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, anybody who's read my writing knows that I'm a skeptic as it pertains to sanctions, not just because I seriously doubt their efficacy over a longer term period of time, but because they demonstrably hurt innocent people inside of Iran. So I would say a couple of things here. On sanctions, we should differentiate between what we wish to be true and what we know to be true. There are a lot of people in this town, especially the architects of the sanctions, who are putting forward the line that sanctions have worked. That's expected. And the argument that they put forward is that over an extended period of time, sanctions put more pain, more pain, more pain, more pain, and then eventually the Iranians reached a breaking point. And then that's where the end of the analysis is. There's no further fleshing out of what's taken place as it pertains to the sanctions. I would say that how they've described the way that sanctions work is exactly how diplomacy works. You keep doing it, you keep doing it, you keep doing it, and then the great magic of diplomacy is that you never know where the discussions will lead once they've started, and then eventually you reach an inflection point where you hopefully can produce success. Sanctions bringing the Iranians to the table, look, you could just as easily say that 19,000 centrifuges brought the United States to the table. I think the more important point here is that both sides, for over 8 years, escalated conflict to the precipice of war. And now in Vienna, they're trying to take a step back and trade in the leverage that they've built through sanctions and centrifuges and other things to try to get some compromise from the other side. Because if sanctions have built up leverage, and I'll agree to that, they've built leverage, but that was not the end goal at the end of the day. So let's not fudge it. That's not the argument that was made 9 months ago. So if sanctions have provided the P5+1 with leverage, that leverage is only as good as your willingness to trade it in for concessions from the Iranian side. Otherwise, it becomes nothing more than a blunt instrument. And I think we need to right-size our expectations of what they can achieve. If sanctions got Rouhani elected and brought the Iranians to the table, why aren't we going around and sanctioning countries into Jeffersonian democracies? Because that's not how sanctions work, and we should be honest about that.
Thank you. Zero centrifuges, dismantling the program? Would Iran ever go along with that?
First of all, just really quick, this is where Reza and I do disagree. I think it's indisputable that sanctions have driven Iran to negotiate to the negotiating table. Obviously, the election of Rouhani changed the whole atmosphere and made it possible. But without the sanctions, Iran would never be negotiating at this stage. And that's precisely why we should give space to negotiations, because sanctions were never intended to bring Iran to its knees. It's questionable if sanctions can do that. But they were designed to get Iran to the negotiating table. And I don't think the United States needed 19,000 centrifuges to come to negotiate. We were already crying ouch when they had 3,000 centrifuges. That was a great defeat, and that violated a red line. So the argument that sanctions didn't work and didn't bring Iran to the negotiating table, I really disagree with that very strongly. As to zero enrichment, the willingness not to insist on zero enrichment also helped bring Iran to the negotiating table, because it created a space where Iran knew ahead that it was going to get something out of the negotiations and that they weren't just punitive. So I think Prime Minister Netanyahu made a very strong case for zero enrichment in his speech at AIPAC, but I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think the negotiations would be taking place if we were still insisting on zero enrichment.
Yeah, this idea of zero enrichment is an important one. And I agree with Michael that the shift in our position in the United States on this idea of zero enrichment is one of the biggest reasons, not the only reason, but one of the biggest reasons why we were able to insert or inject momentum into the talks in Geneva that has carried over into Vienna. The idea that I think we should give more credit to the Iranian people, frankly, than to sanctions, because the Iranian people went out to the polls and brought the most palatable candidate of a neither free nor fair election by international best practices and standards into the executive branch in Iran. And this is a man, Rouhani, together with Dr. Zarif, whether you love him or hate him, you can't dispute that they have a track record of trying to use diplomacy to de-escalate conflict with the West from 2003 to 2005. They were spearheaded that process. And that was before any of the sanctions came into place. So I think we need to reevaluate this assessment. There's a difference between building leverage and bringing back to the table. They never really left the table. There's a pendulum that swings back and forth in Iran, in my view. And the pendulum has swung back to a group of individuals who are more moderate than their predecessors, who were hardline and extreme, far more so. And if we are not able to produce results with them, and if they are not able to produce tangible deliverables that they can take back to Tehran, that pendulum will swing back again. And 6 to 12 months from now, we'll be dealing with the same hardliners who we loathed dealing with in Iran before. So we should be careful about this idea of sanctions.
Before I open the floor, I'll take a question from the overflow, which is very topical and relevant. Either of you can take that question. How do you think the situation in the Ukraine and politics between the US and the Russian will affect the P5+1 negotiations with Iran? Who takes it? You want to take
Sure.
it? Okay.
I think there are two things that I'm keeping my eye on, and this is just me. One, I think anytime there is a global crisis, it allows for people who prefer the U.S. to flex its muscles instead of using its negotiators to go onto television and the radio and to write articles that say that the president is weak and this, that, and the third, when that couldn't be further from the case. Barack Obama's reaction to Ukraine really isn't that different than George Bush's reaction to Georgia. So instead of looking at the individual, we need to look at the tools at our disposal to resolve international conflict. More specifically, I think that at the end of the day, the Russians have an equal interest of not allowing Iran to develop nuclear weapons and to have serious, concrete limitations on the Iranian nuclear program. It's not in Russia's interest to have Iran develop its program beyond a certain point. What that point is remains to be seen. But it's also not in Russia's interest to have this conflict escalate to the precipice of war. Russia is a neighboring country of Iran, and they want more stability in their region, not less. So I think these two things are worth keeping an eye on. But thankfully, I don't think that it's going to carry over to the point where Russia will torpedo the negotiations, or they might drive a harder bargain, but they kind of always do. So I don't think it's going to differ too much.
Michael, this question is specifically for you. It says, what do you believe the impact of Iran's recent talks with France, China, and Germany and other countries about improving economic relation has had on the current negotiations?
Well, that is a fruit of the current negotiations. And obviously, there are a lot of business delegations going to Iran. There are better relations between Iran and Britain. So part of this process is that you're starting to get a thawing, and I guess the kind of a Cold War that existed and the lack of good relations. But critics of the Joint Plan of Action will say, see, even before a comprehensive agreement, the Iranians are already getting sanctions relief. They're already getting businesses lined up. I think the point of view of the administration is that this is healthy. People should be positioning themselves, but that the sanctions are still in effect, and there still is a incredible blockage against countries doing business with Iran.
Yeah. The only other thing I want to add to that is that it's good if there are countries, whether it's the United States or anyone else, showing an interest in doing business in Iran, precisely because that business is not entirely feasible until the backbreaking sanctions, oil and banking, are lifted. And that's not going to happen till the end of the process. So it actually incentivizes going all the way towards a final deal and signing on the dotted line if, in fact, this process continues. If it were possible to break those sanctions and create a new environment where businesses are willing to flout the United States, A, we should ask ourselves, why hasn't it happened yet? And B, if in fact it does happen, we should ask ourselves, what's the United States response going to be? I don't think we have a precedent of the international community willing to test us on this issue. So there's no reason for skepticism just yet.
Yes, please. Just can you wait for the mic and also identify yourself? Sure. Sama, in the front, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. Fascinating conversation. Thanks for doing this. Michael, I agree that we can reach a technical agreement. The question is, how does it get ratified on both sides? I'm an American. I understand the U.S. and maybe Israel's dimension in this. I'm not an Iranian. Reza, can you talk a little bit about the political will that it was going to take to get the Iranians, Rouhani, Khamenei, to support an agreement reached on the technical basis in Geneva?
Sure. I think so far what we've seen is a supreme leader in Iran who has given backing to Rouhani's initiatives. He's come out publicly and said it, and his concrete actions have supported it so far. But there is a caveat, of course, to this. The supreme leader is one of the few within Iran's political elite that has the luxury of long-term planning. Most of them are worried about next week, next month, next year, as it pertains to their political futures. Him, not so much. So as a result, he's positioned himself to win either way. If the talks succeed and there is a final deal, he can say that he supported it and provided the political cover necessary for Rouhani to pursue this initiative successfully. If it fails, he can point to the numerous occasions where he said, see, I told you they were just out to get us. See, I told you they were just trying to pull out the rug from under us. So he's playing both sides at the end of the day. There's no doubt about that. My concern is when those words translate into actions on his part. At what point does he go from warning that the Americans are just out to get the Iranians to actually torpedoing the process? At what point does he unleash the hounds, so to speak? Because right now it's rhetorically that Rouhani's taken a beating from the hardliners on this issue, by the way. We're just talking about the nuclear issue, not anything else. He's taken a beating rhetorically. But in terms of concrete actions, it's been more bark than bite from Iran's hardliners on this issue. At what point does the bark turn into bite? That's what we should be watching.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Greg Thielman, Arms Control Association. I wondered if the speakers could comment on how the U.S. is going to articulate missile limits in these negotiations in light of the fact that there is no multilateral missile ban or treaty that is comparable to the NPT's impact on nuclear technology, and that the only really international constraint we have in recent years is following the first Gulf War, when we prohibited Iraq from testing any missile over 150 kilometers in range. That kind of limit is just inconceivable to Iran, and even goes beyond what is in the Menendez-Kirk bill, which is 500 kilometers. So I can't quite envision what this dialogue is going to look like.
Michael?
Yeah. A very pertinent question, Greg. First of all, this is why possible military dimension is so key, because part of the possible military dimension was testing a reentry vehicle for a missile. So I think the United States is going to insist that Iran come clean on that. That's something they've been trying to do. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has been trying to do since August 2008. And that will be a key indicator into how dangerous the missile program is. At the same time, there's another line which seemed to be developing in Vienna, which was that if you can guarantee that Iran cannot produce a nuclear weapon, then you don't have to worry about the missiles. Because once you know that Iran will not have a weapon, the missile question becomes moot. So I think progress on PMD will be crucial to find out how dangerous the missile program is, to really getting guarantees that Iran can produce a nuclear weapon would diffuse the missile question to some degree, and we could end up with some limit on testing ICBM-type missiles.
David?
Dave Otto, I'm a senior fellow here, scholar. My question is regarding breakout. Israelis are very concerned about lengthening the breakout period for Iran if they renege on any agreement that's reached. And people are talking about a 3-month, 6-month, 1-year breakout. If Iran agrees to not enrich to 20% and only to 3%. We give them we agree to some level of enrichment. Does that change very much the breakout period? And what is crucial to lengthening the breakout period for Iran?
You want to go first?
Sure. I think there's no shortage of technical issues that are gonna apply to the breakout window that you're referring to. It's going to be the kind of centrifuges that they're spinning. It's going to be the amount of centrifuges that they're spinning. It's going to be the degree to which they're able to enrich it up to a certain point. So yeah, it's going to be capped at 3.5 or 5%. It's not going to be up to 20. It's going to be predicated on how many facilities they have. All of these different kinds of issues end up padding the window, so to speak. But the window never fully closes, and I think we should acknowledge that. I can't remember who came up with the phrase, but I fully agree with it, is you can't bomb knowledge. Well, you also can't forget knowledge. You can't assassinate knowledge. Lord knows they've tried, but you can't do that in perpetuity. So at the end of the day, what I think we're really negotiating over here, as Michael talked about, is the devil being in the details. And ideally, you're going to have that 12-month window at the end of the day, but there's a lot of different roads that can get you there. The trick is you need to organize, you need to set up those technical details to make sure that that there's symmetry, because B, if there's symmetry, it becomes easier for both sides to sell at home. We do not want a deal that's very easy for one side to go back to its capital and say, see, we got it, and then the other side, it's very difficult for them to go back. That's the kind of deal that's doomed for failure. So that's why it's good that we're having 4, 5, 6 rounds of talks in Vienna to make sure that we're dotting I's, crossing T's, and finding something that we can both live with. I know that doesn't specifically answer it, but there's just so many ways to get there, in my view, that there's no one right way to articulate it.
Michael, you want
Okay.
to add something?
Well, I think the devil really is in the details, and the details can really be maddening. In terms of breakout, a key question is what they do with the 20% they have and how much they produce. Right now, they're converting some of it into uranium oxide, and that can be reconverted back very easily. Not very easily, but it can be reconverted back into the hexafluoride needed to process further for a nuclear weapon. So there will be the breakout time, there will be the stockpiles they have, and then key will be the kind of inspections that are allowed. Right now, the key issue for the International Atomic Energy, the UN nuclear watchdog, is to apply the additional protocol. And what you would need in Iran is an additional protocol plus. Now, how willing is Iran, viewing its sovereignty, going to be to allow for inspections that start getting towards this anytime, anywhere kind of situation we had in Iraq? These details are highly significant. Of course, Reza's right. There's got to be reciprocity with the sanctions, but I believe that's baked into the process. The problem, precisely going forward, is what Iran is going to allow, because they have to allow this. How much will they really neutralize their stockpile of 20%? These are key issues which will be very difficult to negotiate.
Can I just add one quick thing to that? Because you made a really important point, and the important point he said was what Iran allows. I want to tack on one quick thing, which is what we allow. The one outstanding issue that really stands out in my mind is how long is Iran going to be treated differently after signing a final deal than other NPT signatories, right? There's a debate going on about this issue. The Iranians are saying, sure, we'll be treated differently for 3 to 5 years. The United States is saying, no, you're going to be treated differently for 25 years. Well, 3 to 5 years is going to be tough to swallow here, because the next American president is not going to want the deal, a final deal, to expire on his or her watch. 25 years is frankly not sellable in Tehran. And we should begin to understand that crystal clear. So at some point in time, we're going to have to figure out if it's possible to meet in the middle on this critical issue.
You agree?
Well, going forward, this is a good point out, but the bottom line is we're going to a situation where Iran has been in noncompliance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where they hid a nuclear program for 18 years, where they were twice caught trying to develop secret plants. This is not a question where, with all the goodwill of Rouhani going forward, now we're people dealing in goodwill. There is tremendous lack of trust of Iran, not because of the 35 years, but because of what they've done on the nuclear program. And this lack of trust will manifest itself in very tough demands, which might go towards the 25 years. And frankly, this is not something Iran can get out of. They're going to have to face it squarely. Iran is under suspicion of, over decades, secretly trying to develop a nuclear weapon. And that's what's going on here. It's not the years of mistrust. It's a highly technical issue. It goes to the heart of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And this is one of the reasons why it's going to be so difficult going forward.
Yes, the lady here. We had 3 questions from this side of the table. Now we move to this side. Okay.
Faye Moqtadir, the question is from Mr. Adler. You mentioned that the purpose of the sanctions was to bring the Iranians at the negotiation table. I thought that I was under the impression that it was to curtail their nuclear program, which it didn't happen. If the purpose was to bring them at the negotiated table, well, why didn't we negotiate with them 10, 12 years ago? I mean, they were willing to negotiate with America 10, 12 years ago. And their nuclear program was in much less advanced position than they are right now. Thank you.
One has to bring them to the negotiating table in order to curtail the program. It's a 2-step process. And the United States was not involved in the negotiations up until 2006. It was Europe who was negotiating with Iran. And the United States, rightly or wrongly, did not want to be part of the negotiations. And then when they finally stepped forward to be part of the negotiations, Condoleezza Rice made this statement, I'll negotiate with Iran anytime, anywhere. But the United States was still insisting that Iran, as a precondition to negotiations, suspend uranium enrichment. And the Iranians did that from 2003 to 2005. That was when Rouhani was running the thing. And they didn't stop that because Rouhani wanted to. They were usurped by the change in government and by the change in attitude. And quite frankly, the supreme leader probably got fed up because he saw Iran suspending, and negotiations not going anywhere. And at that point, Rouhani became discredited in terms of negotiations, and you had the much tougher line under President Ahmadinejad. So the United States, to answer your question, the United States was not present 10 years ago, and when it did decide to be present, they took a position which was totally unacceptable to Iran. And that's the genius of what's happened now. We have a position which is acceptable to Iran. The 2 sides are talking, and hopefully this will lead to something.
Reza, a question from the overflow. What do you think the nuclear program means to the Iranian government? What is their current objective, keeping in mind its obvious cost?
Okay, well, sure. It's a great question. And if the costs are obvious, then there's no real need to address those. I would say that the goal depends on who you're talking to in Iran. There's a very serious debate going on about what this program is and what it should be going forward. And we should acknowledge that. Because if we acknowledge that, then we're essentially acknowledging that Iran has politics. And that's a very important step towards understanding the decision-making process inside that country. Because we were told before the election that it's one man, one vote, and that vote is the supreme leader. And then it didn't turn out that way. So I think all of us, myself included, should be going back to the drawing board and reevaluating a lot of what we perceive to be, common assumptions pertaining to its decision-making. Now, on this one specific issue more generally, or more specifically on the program, I think Rouhani's team has made it clear that they want to have a nuclear program that can produce energy. They're willing to accept the concrete limitations that the international community wants to put in place within reason, and that's what they're essentially negotiating over now. What's reasonable, because what's reasonable in the eyes of the Iranians is different than what's reasonable in the eyes of the P5+1. Can they meet somewhere in the middle? That's what we're about to find out. But we should also acknowledge that there is a very different train of thought in Iran. There are individuals inside the Iranian political elite that don't want limitations to the Iranian nuclear program, that think that agreeing to those kinds of limitations is just setting them up for the same fate as somebody like Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, for example. And we do know that prior to 2003, there was a weapons dimension to the program. I know Michael stated that earlier, but nobody was really debating that fact. So going forward, instead of asking ourselves what their goals are, I would say that A, we should understand that there are 2 different schools of thought, and B, since everybody here knows which school of thought we prefer, what can we do to empower that school of thought to ensure that it prevails and that the pendulum doesn't swing back to the hardliners 6 to 12 months from now? That's the important question.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ahmed. I'm an intern at the Wilson Center. My question is, what do you think the realistic impact of organizations like AIPAC and Israel will have on the long-term negotiations? And what are the repercussions, say, that a deal is reached that Israel is not 100% happy with?
Okay, let's take another. There was a question in the back and John here. Yes. I'm taking 3 questions together.
Sure.
Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Stefan Grob. I'm with Euronews European Television. There is some talk in this town about the possible resumption of diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran. What are your thoughts on that? Is it desirable? Is it realistic? What's your take?
Okay, and John, you had a question, yeah. I think the mic is coming. Okay.
John Parker here at the Wilson Center. This is the flip side of the earlier question on the missile issue. I'm curious, in Vienna, what are the assumptions or what's the scuttlebutt as to how much missile capability Iran actually has to deliver a nuclear weapon?
Okay.
Sure, I'll take Bob at it.
Take
2 minutes?
yeah, 2 minutes.
3 questions.
To answer all the questions.
The first question about AIPAC, you saw very clearly over the past few weeks the limitations of AIPAC's reach and punch, because AIPAC certainly wanted more sanctions, and both the Congress and AIPAC have retreated from that position. I think it's very hard when the administration wants to have a chance to negotiate and has a package which enables negotiations to go forward. How can you stand against that? You've got to give them the chance to do it. But I certainly think that AIPAC and the Congress are sharpening their knives and waiting for July or January. And if an agreement is not reached, you're going to see a lot of pressure from both of those organizations. As far as diplomatic relations between Iran and the U.S., I personally think it's great. It'd be great if it happened, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. And it is to stress that the P5+1 are negotiating with Iran on the nuclear issue. It is not meant to be a wider discussion, and it won't be a wider discussion. If there's to be a wider discussion, it will come afterwards. And the last question about missile capability, Iran has done really well. I mean, they have a solid-state missile they're launching. Whether they have no one thinks they have ICBM capability, but there is a feeling that they progressed very well in their missile program, and that to some extent they've outgrown the North Koreans who got them started.
Very quickly on these 3. Number 1, on Israel and AIPAC. I think at the end of the day, it's hard to envision a deal that Israel isn't going to be able to swallow and live with. I think there is an interest on the part of the Israeli government to make a fuss about this process as it's going forward, because if you raise the costs now, it serves 2 purposes. A, it increases what you get out of the deal, and we've already seen that. For example, the interim deal in Geneva was supposed to be signed, then the French foreign minister, at the behest of our friends in Israel, added a few terms to the negotiations, so we all got to go back to Geneva for one last time. That's 1. And then 2, Mr. Netanyahu has a coalition in Israel, a political coalition, that leans to the right. So if he's screaming at the mountaintop, that benefits his domestic politics, so that he can go back if a final deal is signed to say, see, I kicked, fought, and screamed, and I had your back the entire way, but the Americans just wouldn't listen to me. So all politics is local. On resuming diplomatic relations, I share Michael's view. I think that's something that a lot of people, most people, would like to see, but we're not anywhere close to that point just yet. We've taken some important steps in that direction, though, and we should acknowledge that. But there's a lot of issues that need to be unpacked. This is just one. So it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And on missiles, just to add to what Michael said, this is one of those issues that's going to be discussed at the end of the process. Ballistic missiles wasn't an issue that was added to the agenda in Vienna. There are United Nations Security Council resolutions about this issue, so it was going to have to be addressed eventually. Where it gets addressed in the negotiations, I think, is what they were haggling over, and I think it's going to happen towards the end because it's one of the stickier issues.
Thank you very much. We covered a small fraction of the nuclear deal and nuclear program today. We are having another program on March 26 covering domestic issues, the upcoming parliamentary elections in Iran, human rights issues, all the issues that we were not able to touch upon today. Please join me in thanking our two presenters.
Thank you.